Before I proceed with this video, can I just again remind everybody who's watching this video on Rumble, and indeed who watches Duran, Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou videos on Rumble, that if you go to the top of the video, you will find a red maroon button. If you press that red maroon button, it will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can join our thriving Locals community, become, if you choose, an active Locals member, at which point you can start to publish your own exclusive content on our Locals page and also participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place exclusively on Locals. So with that, let me now proceed to a run-up of the latest events on the world crisis, the great global crisis, which of course always centers on Ukraine. Now, in many programs, multiple programs on this channel, I have spoken about the overriding importance for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian government, to start getting a grip on reality, start to understand the disaster that it is facing as this war continues and is prolonged, start to take into account the devastation of its cities, the collapse of its economy, and most specifically the deaths of thousands, probably, of its young men in the battlefields, which are, let me reiterate again, overwhelmingly concentrated and focused on the Donbass. Well, yesterday, Tuesday, Ukraine took what I hope will be the first halting, very uncertain step in that direction. For the first time, it put forward a document, an actual proposal for peace, in which it made an important concession, in fact, an extremely important concession. It, for the first time, formally forswore NATO membership. Now, this has been something that President Zelensky in particular has floated in multiple interviews ever since the war began, but the Ukraine has never up to now, the Ukrainian side has never up to now put it together in a formal document, and it did so finally yesterday. Moreover, the document goes further than just forswearing NATO membership. It says that Ukraine will not participate in any military blocs, and it also committed Ukraine to having no bases on its territory. Well, of course, it's historically made that commitment before, but also to hosting no foreign troops on its territory, and not engaging in any military drills or maneuvers with foreign troops on its territory. It also committed itself, as it has, must be said, done in the past, to forswearing any ambitions to develop weapons of mass destruction, chemical, bacteriological, or nuclear. Now, as I said previously, some of this has already been done before, but it is an offer made in the course of a war in order to achieve what is intended eventually to be a comprehensive treaty. Moreover, and perhaps most importantly, the document goes further, and in terms of troop deployments, foreign troop deployments, exercises with foreign troops, bases on Ukrainian soil, it actually concedes to Russia a veto on any possibility of deployment of troops, of bases, or of maneuvers, military drills taking place on Ukrainian territory. Now, this is done through the complicated mechanism of giving Ukraine guarantors for its security. I'll come to all of that in a moment and explain what that all means. Guarantors for its security. Each one of these guarantors, and a whole string of countries is to be included amongst them, is to have a right of veto on deployment of troops, foreign troops, hardware, bases, drills on Ukrainian territory. The only one amongst these that ultimately matters is, of course, Russia, with whom this treaty will be made. And since Russia will be a guarantor, Ukraine is in effect giving Russia a veto power over deployments of foreign troops, bases, and maneuvers on its territory. And Ukraine has taken also the first halting steps towards accepting territorial realities. It seeks legally binding security guarantees for itself, but for the first time it accepts that these legally binding security guarantees will not extend to Crimea or to Donbass, though it's unclear what exactly Ukraine precisely means by Donbass. But anyway, to the areas which are, as Ukraine says, in contention. So Ukraine, by differentiating these territories from itself, from the rest of its territory, or from the remainder of its territory, by saying that the legally binding security guarantees Ukraine is seeking will not extend to these territories, is in effect starting to move towards a position of accepting that Russia has some kind of preeminent position over these territories in Donbass and in Crimea. And in fact, if you go further, apparently into this document, I haven't seen it, I'm just basing all that I'm saying on the summaries that the Ukrainian officials and the Russian officials, the Russian negotiators and the Ukrainian negotiators have published about this document. Apparently, if you go into the detail, Ukraine has again, for the first time, apparently accepted that the future status both of Crimea and of Donbass is up for discussion, though again it is very unclear what the format of that discussion is supposed to be. And the Ukrainian negotiators continue to insist that these territories are Ukrainian territories. So these are very, very, very modest steps, and unsurprisingly perhaps, they're hedged with all kinds of conditions, all kinds of demands, which I suspect the Russians will not only reject, but probably aren't going to even take particularly seriously. So the commitment, the acceptance that Ukraine will not join NATO is hedged around with all of these requests for legally binding security guarantees, which Ukrainian officials would say would be analogous to giving Ukraine something like NATO, the Article 5 commitment that NATO provides to its members. And it even contains provisions for no-fly zones in the event that Ukraine is the subject of some sort of aggression or attack in future. This is, by the way, a completely hopeless idea. I think it's most unlikely that the Russians will ever agree to it. But I would say that given that NATO has conspicuously refused to ride to Ukraine's rescue over this conflict, whatever legally binding security guarantees Ukraine is now seeking from the Western powers already look problematic, to put it mildly. Then the Ukrainians have thrown in an extraordinary provision, which is that Russia supposedly mustn't object to Ukraine's bid for EU membership. Russia has never made taken any point or position on Ukraine's bid for EU membership. I'm pretty sure that the Russians would not be happy if Ukraine did seek EU membership. But as far as I can tell, this has never been a subject that the Russians have raised. They've never formally objected to any Ukrainian EU membership bid. So it's straightforwardly bizarre that the Ukrainians are floating it now. briefly, these demands, these comments about security guarantees that all but amount to NATO Article 5 provisions and Ukraine's Russia not objecting to EU membership are clearly intended to sugar the pill being the fact that Ukraine is now accepting that it will not ever join NATO, something which Ukrainian governments at one time acknowledged when Ukraine became an independent state in 1991. It committed itself to being neutral and non-aligned after the Orange Revolution of 2004. That changed, and of course in 2008 at that disastrous summit in Bucharest, the Ukrainians were formally invited to join NATO. The decision which, in my opinion, is the root cause of this entire conflict. Well, there we are. The Ukrainians, as I said, have made halting moves towards meeting Russian demands, but obviously they've not gone anywhere near far enough. And the Russians today, Dmitry Peskov, the presidential spokesman, Putin spokesman, said that these moves by the Ukrainians were promising but modest, and the Russian chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, made it absolutely clear that these are Ukrainian proposals. They're not proposals that Russia is in any way accepting at this point in time, and they are the basis of discussion. They give the Russians something to work with in terms of negotiations, something for the negotiators to take back with them to Moscow, and the Russians will, at some point, provide their responses. But Medinsky, contrary to what some people are saying, was also careful to remind everybody that the Russians already made their demands. They made their demands when the negotiations first began in February. This after many weeks of discussions and many weeks of war is the first formal Ukrainian response. Now, Medinsky also went on to say that he didn't expect any agreement to take place soon, and he suggested that this would be a long and difficult process of negotiation. And of course, the Ukrainians have not made any proposal to address the issue of denazification, which the Russians have raised, and comments by Russian officials since the Ukrainian proposal appear to suggest that the Russians have not, in fact, wavered from that demand. So, as I said, this is perhaps a first step by Ukraine to acknowledge realities, to make a concrete proposal, an actual written proposal, one which forswears NATO membership and which starts to edge towards Russian demands on demilitarization, on non-alignment, and on the status of territories like Crimea and Donbass, but which it's almost inconceivable that the Russians will see as coming anywhere close towards meeting their fundamental conditions. Now, how has this come about? Why did Ukraine suddenly make this move? Because up to now, if you follow Russian commentaries, especially commentaries on the Russian presidential website, you will see that the Russians up to now have been deeply frustrated by the fact that the Ukrainians have not been negotiating on any of the substantive issues, so that all the talks up to now have been about humanitarian corridors and local ceasefires from besieged cities. Well, I think that the answer to that is that obviously the military situation in Donbass is becoming increasingly desperate for Ukraine, despite all the various claims of victories, which I will come to briefly, shortly. But I think overall and overriding all of this was deep Ukrainian disappointment about the failure of the Western powers to do anything substantive over the course of last week, when the Western powers, the G7, the EU Council and NATO all had their summit meetings in Brussels, and when President Biden himself visited Poland last weekend, making the disastrous speech there, which I've discussed in my previous video. The Ukrainians clearly were holding out for some hope that the NATO powers, the Western powers, would do something more substantive to assist them. They've at various times floated the possibilities of no-fly zones, NATO no-fly zones over Ukraine, always a non-starter in my opinion. The Polish Deputy Prime Minister, Jarosław Kaczynski, has discussed the possibility of a NATO peacekeeping force or intervention force in Ukraine. There's been ideas about sending Polish troops into Western Ukraine. There have been discussions, talk about the Western powers supplying Ukraine with tanks, of which it is apparently running desperately short, and of aircraft, of which it is also apparently running desperately short. But none of that happened, nor did the Western powers announce any further substantive sanctions on Russia. As I'm going to discuss in a follow-up program to this one, probably tomorrow, it's the Russians at the moment who appear to be moving towards sanctioning the West. The Western powers have balked at cancelling imports of Russian oil, gas and coal, and no further moves were taken to remove further Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank payment system. And in fact, as I understand, 70% of the Russian banking system is still in fact connected to SWIFT. So I think that the Ukrainians had hoped for some big moves from the Western powers, and apart from that frankly deranged speech that President Biden gave in Warsaw on Sunday, they got nothing. They got absolutely nothing that they could use at all. And President Zelensky has already expressed disappointment. He spoke about the cowardice of the Western powers. And over the weekend, as I think it became increasingly clear to him and his officials that the Western cavalry is not going to ride to Ukraine's rescue, he began to do various things. He first of all gave a long interview with Russian journalists. These are not Russian journalists from what might be called the mainstream media in Russia. These are independent news providers, some of whom are not even based in Russia, but who, if you like, represent dissident voices in Russia, but who nonetheless are Russians. And over the course of that interview, he made it for the first time forcefully and clear that Ukraine is dropping its post-2004 quest for NATO membership. Now, he hedged it, as I said, all with all kinds of conditions. He made all kinds of statements about the Russians, which the Russians will no doubt ignore, but which they will certainly find unfavourable. But he did at least give finally the impression that the decision has been made to drop this long-standing quest by Ukraine for NATO membership. A quest which, as I said, goes back all the way to the Orange Revolution of 2004. And he followed that up with calls to President Erdogan of Turkey, in which he appears to have asked President Erdogan to convene a meeting of the Ukrainian and Russian negotiators. Up to now, for the last couple of weeks, these negotiators have only been in touch with each other in a virtual format. Zelensky seems to have asked the President Erdogan, to convene this actual formal face-to-face meeting of the negotiators in Istanbul, and Erdogan duly telephoned to Putin, appears to have told Putin that the Ukrainians were preparing a formal offer which they wanted to give to the Russians in person. Putin, who obviously has to keep Erdogan on side to some respect, in some respects, Erdogan, though a leader of a NATO member state, has up to now refused to impose sanctions on Russia and has taken what I think the Russians would consider a reasonably balanced position in this conflict. Anyway, Putin agreed to Erdogan's request, so the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators were sent to Istanbul, and at that meeting in Istanbul, the Ukrainians finally put to the Russians in writing their offer. And that is where we are with the negotiations. Now, what has added a lot to the confusion is that prior to this meeting, the Ukrainians did something which actually violates the terms of an agreement that they entered into with the Russians at the outset of their negotiations, which by the way happened in February, which is that they would not talk to third parties about what the contents of the discussions were. In fact, the Ukrainians appear to have discussed in detail their proposal with the Financial Times, and the Financial Times duly published a lead article in which they represented the Ukrainian proposals for a draft agreement between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Now, the Russian negotiators in Istanbul went out of their way to make it clear that this was not the case, but that was how this agreement was spun. So that, of course, I think affected some of the understanding of what was happening in Istanbul, that the receipt of the Ukrainian proposals was somehow a negotiation, an agreement by the Russians to these proposals, which was simply not the case. It was based on that deeply misleading article by the Financial Times. And then there was a follow-up statement by the Russian negotiators, by Vladimir Medinsky and Fomin, the Russian deputy defense minister, who's also part of the Russian delegation, in which many of Medinsky's words were, I think, taken out of context. He made it clear that this is only the start of a negotiation and that negotiation has a very long way to go. And though he said that the talks had been constructive, the talks, by the way, were very short. All that there seems to have happened is that the Ukrainians simply gave the Russians their proposals, and that there were some exchanges, but nothing of any substance took place. But anyway, apart from saying that the talks were constructive in the sense that the Russians had received these proposals and would convey them to their leadership in Moscow, Medinsky did also say that the Russians were prepared, in light of what the Ukrainians had done, to meet them halfway on one point, which is that up to now, the Russians have said that they're not prepared to have a meeting between their presidents, the president of Russia, that's to say Putin, and Zelensky, an actual summit meeting, until the full terms of what the Russians are insisting must be a comprehensive treaty between the Ukrainians and the Russians is agreed. Well, Medinsky said that the summit meeting can now happen at a meeting of the foreign ministers, the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers, where this comprehensive treaty agreed by the negotiators is initialed by the foreign ministers. Now, this is made to look like a huge concession. I think Medinsky even used the word huge. It's actually a token concession. it still essentially says that the terms of the treaty must be agreed by the negotiators, cleared by Moscow and Kiev, stamped and approved by the foreign ministers, and only then and not before can the summit meeting between the presidents take place. Personally, I can't really see that this is any sort of departure, substantive departure from the previous Russian position at all. But Medinsky packaged it as some sort of concession, presumably in order to please the Turks, but also in order perhaps to give the Ukrainians something that they could take back to Kiev and pass on to their leadership there as a sign of some kind of progress. Zelensky having been particularly anxious to meet with Putin ever since he became president back in 2019. But there was something else, and this is, I think, where much of the muddle and confusion has come, because the Russians also announced that they would be reducing their military activity around Kiev, and again the Russians packaged this as a concession to the Ukrainians in light of what the Ukrainians have done in respect of the proposals that the Ukrainians have put forward. Now, I have to say that this has attracted world attention. It's also extremely misleading, because the Russians, having already announced last week that long discussion, but General Rutskoy made, that the first phase of their operation had been completed, and that the second phase of their operation, which is now going to focus on the Donbass, is now going to start. Something, by the way, which the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, also reiterated in a conference with military leaders in Moscow yesterday. Having said all of those things, it's quite clear for some time that the Russian military presence in and around Kiev was already being scaled down, or was already in the process of being scaled down anyway. Now, this requires some discussion, because I think this is a point which has not been fully clarified or understood by many people. Let me go back to some of the early videos I made right back to February, and also to certain discussions that we had, Alex Christoforou and I, at the start of this affair, back in February and early March, on the Duran. And in all of those programs, repeatedly, we said that this assumption that was governing much Western commentary, that the Russians were preparing to storm Kiev, was simply wrong. It was contradicted by the very fact that the Russians were negotiating with the Ukrainian government. It made no sense for the Russians to storm the capital of the government that they were negotiating with. And if you go back to what happened in Syria, which is perhaps the model one should look at to look at this conflict from a Russian perspective, what the Russians do is that they negotiate and they wage war at one and the same time, something which Westerners don't understand, but which is very much in keeping with the Russian conception that, in Clausewitz's words, war is an extension of politics. Sometimes Clausewitz said politics, sometimes, by the way, he also said diplomacy. So diplomacy and war, in the Russian way, go hand in hand with each other. So those Russian troops were positioned around Kiev for two purposes. Firstly, to put pressure on the Ukrainians to start negotiating and to negotiate in earnest. And secondly, also, as the Russian military leadership has explained, to pin down Ukrainian troops whilst the forces in the main army of the main part of Ukraine's army, its best troops, its major military force in Donbass, was isolated from the rest of Ukraine and put in a position where it could be essentially encircled and destroyed. So, from a Russian point of view, those two objectives have to some extent been achieved. The Ukrainians are now negotiating. They've come up with a counter-proposal. It may not be a particularly good counter-proposal, but it is a counter-proposal. The Ukrainians have now shifted ground from a position where they were essentially refusing to negotiate. At one point, they were saying that they were not prepared to negotiate on substantive issues until there'd been a ceasefire and the Russians had pulled out of Ukraine entirely. Well, they've now gone back on that. They've come up with a proposal which accepts that Ukraine will not join NATO. It may be hedged around with unacceptable conditions. It may be hedged around with far-fetched proposals and ideas. They've also accepted that Donbass and Crimea must be differentiated from what they still claim to be the rest of Ukraine. They've still come up with all kinds of proposals about how to deal with the issues of Crimea and Donbass in ways that the Russians would say is unacceptable. But again, it's movement of a kind. It is at last a step towards negotiations. So the need to keep Russian troops very close to Kiev, threatening its center, the diplomatic need to do that has to some extent diminished. But the other factor, perhaps the more important factor, which is the need to keep Ukrainian troops pinned down in and around Kiev whilst the forces in Donbass are isolated, that's abated also, because the Russians clearly consider that the forces in Donbass have been isolated. Ukraine has lost most of its armoured forces. It's short of ammunition and fuel. It can't resupply those troops in Donbass. It can't move reinforcements, mechanised reinforcements, to down Donbass to engage in the battle. So again, there is some logic to relaxing the hold that the Russians have in and around Kiev. Now, we'll see how large and extensive the Russian redeployments around Kiev are. We're supposed to be getting an announcement from the Russian General Staff either later today or perhaps tomorrow. We will see what it amounts to. But so far, from what I can understand, only part of the Russian forces have been redeployed, and these are the lighter airborne troops who were part of the original spearhead that was deployed close to Kiev in the early days of the fighting. So we'll see what happens. Now, I'm going to add here one further point. This is that, again, if you follow Russian tactics during the Syrian war, especially in its first year, you will find that, again, the Russians at that point did much the same thing. They would negotiate. In the first year, they were primarily negotiating with the US, which they considered to be the party that was ultimately in control of the enemy forces in Syria. And there were various agreements. There was an important discussion, as I recall, between then Secretary of State Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. And I remember that I think it was either in January or February 2016, a few weeks after the initial Russian deployment to Syria, the Russians again announced a drawdown of forces, and they seem to be withdrawing forces from their Khmeimim air base back to Russia. And again, there was an enormous amount of confusion, some anger on the part of some people who wanted the Russians to continue that operation, some unwillingness on the part of others to accept what was happening, some confusion about what was actually going on. But it became very quickly clear that what the Russians had announced as being partly a response to diplomatic moves by the American side, and the Americans in those talks with Lavrov, the talks between Kerry and Lavrov, had seemed to agree to certain deconfliction mechanisms in Syria. Anyway, what the Russians presented as a response to those deconfliction moves, it turned out was a redeployment of forces. In other words, forces that had already been active in the first weeks of the fighting were redeployed to Russia and were eventually replaced by new personnel, fresh personnel who'd not been in combat, who were coming fresh to the battle. I suspect there is something of this also going on as well. We've now had over 30 days of conflict, and it would be unsurprising if some of the Russian troops in Ukraine were not by this point tired and didn't need to be brought back to Russia and rotated with fresher troops who are able to take over and resume the operation. And by the way, this does seem to be happening not just around Kiev and Chernigov, but on a much bigger scale. There are reports of a major build-up of Russian forces across the border around Kursk. There's even suggestions that there are actually more tanks and armoured vehicles, Russian tanks and armoured vehicles now positioned in Kursk, around Kursk, within Russia, near the border, than there were before the actual fighting started in February. And that does beg some questions, and it does suggest, if it is true, that there is indeed a major redeployment exercise being underway, that troops are now being rotated as the Russian General Staff starts to work towards moving towards phase 2. And all the indications are that phase 2 is indeed underway. Now, over the course of the last 24 hours, Russian missile attacks on every part of Ukraine have continued unabated. They've even continued unabated in the precincts of Kiev itself, but they've also continued to launch missile strikes on ammunition depots, on fuel depots, on assembly points of Ukrainian troops all over Ukraine. And apparently there's continued to be heavy shelling of Ukrainian forces in Donbass itself. And by the way, it seems that the area around the Azovstal factory in Mariupol continues to be cleared. And Ramzan Kadyrov, the governor of Chechnya, the Chechen leader, who's just been promoted, by the way, to lieutenant general in the Russian armed forces, is now apparently in Mariupol, where he's apparently going to supervise the last battle, which will presumably be the battle for the Azovstal factory. So we see very much the same pattern as we saw in Syria, Russians using diplomatic moves as a cover for rotating their forces, for resupplying their forces, for preparing for the next battle that is to come. General Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, even as the negotiations were underway, was also speaking in that conference with military leaders in Moscow about Russia moving forward to what will presumably be phase 2. Phase 2, which is the decisive phase in this war, is the final destruction of Ukrainian forces in Donbass and the clearing of Donbass of all Ukrainian soldiers. The negotiations will continue even as that battle also continues, and we will see what the outcome will be. I hope that having taken this first step, the Ukrainians, who must now be under no illusions about the fact that they are completely alone, will follow up on these first tentative concessions that they have made and start negotiating from this point on in earnest with the purpose, with the intention of saving their country. We shall see whether that kind of wisdom prevails, and I hope anyway that I have explained clearly, as I see them, the rather confused and tangled events of yesterday. Thank you again for joining me today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on this channel and on main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Also, as I've said previously, you can find us on other platforms. I already mentioned Rumble and Locals at the start of this program. You can also, of course, find us on other platforms, BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, SuperU, and others. And of course, please also remember we've also got our own TV channel, which you can also find links to. And last but not least, if you want to support us, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there. Our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And of course, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.